Hello, bioethics students. Welcome back. I wanted to take this opportunity to say a little bit more about this article, Is Protection Against HPV Ethically Required in the Garden of Immunity? I thought the group that took on this article did a great job with their project, and the people they spoke to gave us so much more information about this topic to think about. And so I want to compliment them on their project, but I also felt like there was more to say about this article that I wanted to be sure was communicated. So I want to do this short recording just to highlight a few parts of the article that I think are useful for you to review and think about more deeply, and to help you prepare for the final exam, and to be able to think more effectively about the article for writing your paper as well. So to begin with, here is this little PowerPoint I created. So the conclusion, Cambray's conclusion, is that in most cases parents are ethically required to choose vaccination for their children. She's talking here about the HPV vaccination specifically. So I want to just make sure you understand the structure of her paper, and then what I want to highlight is what's going on in the last 3 or 4 pages of the paper, because I think it's so relevant to the work that we've already done on moral theory and how we're thinking about bioethics in this class. So to begin with, a few facts about HPV, which you can go back and read for yourself in the article, but I think it's so important that this infection has infected about 80% of sexually active adults. So that's astounding to me, and it was astounding to me before I read this article. I was aware of that statistic, and that's a lot of people. 80% of the people you might be having sex with have probably had HPV, including you. So in most cases it goes unnoticed, but you can still infect others. And it can infect areas not covered by a condom, which means that it's not always prevented by condom use. So those two statistics are things that I've known for a while that made me interested in covering this topic specifically with a group of students who are of the age to be sexually active. So I hope that you will think more about HPV and as you have sex in your life, which you can't do now because we're all social distancing, but someday we will stop doing that, and there will be more casual dating, and it's just something to, I think, that knowledge about can really help keep you safe and healthy. So as far as the argument in this paper, the structure of the argument, Cambray is beginning from a very explicit starting point that generally vaccination is ethically required when we're talking about serious illnesses. Okay, so when she says she's using that as a standpoint, that's where she's starting. So if you're not on board with that premise, then she's not really speaking to you. She's trying to get people who are on board with the idea that you should be vaccinated against serious illnesses when you can be. Of course, sometimes you have medical conditions that preclude you from being vaccinated. That's not, she's not saying that never happens, but as long as you don't have those kinds of medical conditions that preclude you from being vaccinated, for the most serious illnesses for which there are vaccines, you should be vaccinated. We should require people to be vaccinated. Okay, so that's her starting point. So really the person she's speaking to is a person who accepts that, who accepts that something like measles, if there's a vaccine available, we should get it, but who thinks that HPV is different from these other diseases. So that's who she's addressing. So it's important to keep in mind who her audience is. It's a person who thinks, yeah, you should be vaccinated against some serious diseases, but HPV is an exception. Okay, she lists some arguments against HPV vaccination at the outset, which I will leave you to read for yourself, but she dismisses most of those concerns. But really, the bulk of her article is spent addressing this idea that vaccination is not necessary for HPV for various reasons. Here are 3 differences that are offered to say that HPV is an exception to these other vaccinations that we should receive. So one is that it's recommended for pre-adolescents, okay, and adolescents, not for infants or adults. That makes it unique in certain ways. Also that it prevents a sexually transmitted infection, which makes it unique in certain ways. It's not just transmitted through casual contact or breathing shared air like coronavirus. And this gendered element of the vaccination question, which is that the vaccine was first approved for females and not males. So she wants to address these three differences directly, and her conclusion is going to be that HPV, like other serious diseases, is something we should vaccinate for. Okay, so the first consideration, that it's recommended for pre-adolescents. Well, the important point about this, she says, is that in most cases, the decision of whether to get vaccinated is up to the parent of the person who would actually be vaccinated. So that is important for thinking about this issue. The second difference she highlights is that HPV vaccination prevents an STI. So again, that it's not spread other ways. Well, one of the problems with this being true of HPV vaccination, along with the fact that it's recommended for adolescents, is that parents are usually ones making this decision, but parents can't control what their children are doing sexually. And they can't control what their child will be doing in the future sexually. And so if a parent has, a strong abstinence ethic in the household and expects the child to abide by that forever, that may be their reason for not vaccinating their child, but that's not a good reason, Cambray thinks, because they can't control that. And maybe their child agrees with the abstinence-only ethic for a little while they're growing up, and then changes their mind when they get to be teenagers. So the problem with the combination of the vaccine being for adolescents and minors, primarily targeted at that age range, and being a vaccine which tries to prevent an STI, is that parents don't have control over their child's sexual activity on into the future, but they do have control over whether they should be vaccinated. So just something she's highlighting. And the other thing she highlights in this section is that sexual activity is not always a choice. So she shares a lot of statistics about unwanted sexual contact and rape among different rates of sexual assault between men and women, and all sorts of statistics related to this point, that sexual activity is not always a choice. Okay, the third consideration that she's addressing that sets HPV apart, but she thinks is not a reason not to require vaccination of everyone, males and females, is this idea that the gender differences in how the vaccine was initially administered, and discussion about whether both genders should be vaccinated or who should be vaccinated. So she raises a number of points about this topic. One is that one of the reasons females are vaccinated and not males were initially is that females have higher risks associated with contracting the virus because of cervical cancer and the link between HPV and cervical cancer. So she acknowledges that, but she also points out that males also carry some risk of having serious complications from acquiring HPV. But more importantly, she thinks it's not just for the protection of themselves that males ought to also be vaccinated, but for thinking of immunity as a shared space and creating as much immunity as possible within our collective that requires vaccinating males. Also, it will make the population as a whole less susceptible to contracting HPV and therefore some cancers. And another point is that she spends a lot of time addressing on page 129 is this idea that when you vaccinate only females, you increase stigmas against female sexuality, and this idea of preserving females' purity and other related stigmas that go along with this practice. So I encourage you to read that section of the article more thoroughly to understand what she's talking about with these gendered differences in how we and who we vaccinate. Okay, but to me, the most important part of this article is the discussion like I said on the last few pages, where she's talking about this notion of the garden of immunity and a collectivist ethic that understands how all people are connected. And right away, this should be bringing up memories, ideas from our previous readings on feminist ethics of care and indigenous ethics, and the tension between those kinds of ethical frameworks and the other moral theories that we looked at, like utilitarianism and Kantian deontology, because there's so much good stuff happening in these 3 pages. So I would also encourage you to go reread the very end of this article. I'm going to bring it up here so you can see where I'm talking about. Scroll through it. Hopefully that doesn't make you dizzy. But it's right here, starting at the end of the article, when she starts talking about medical models here. And that's where I want to start now with this section of the lecture. On page 130, she discusses these 2 models of medicine, the paternalistic model and the consumeristic model. And the paternalistic model sort of puts all the power in the hands of the doctor and says the doctor knows best, and assumes that the doctor is always going to make beneficent choices in terms of the well-being of their patients, and proceeds under those assumptions, and sort of just gives the doctor full power to make these decisions. The consumeristic model puts the power in the hands of the consumer, being the patient in this case. So assumes that everyone's going to make a self-interested decision, and that the doctor and the consumer, or the patient in this case, should be free to make their own decisions, and the patient should be able to make decisions about what concerns their own care and their welfare, and that there's going to be kind of a market where the consumers will eliminate bad doctors through their choices of choosing care that works for them and that increases their own health, etc. So you can go back and reread her description of these 2 different models of medicine, but what she ultimately proposes is a 3rd model that's not paternalistic or consumeristic, it's maternalistic in her terms, okay? And she talks about this in the following terms, which I would just share this quote I want to read aloud. So the quote is that this approach, which is based on care ethics, the approach could involve open and honest conversations about the risks of HPV, a trusting triangular relationship between parent, child, and physician that allows for a variety of views toward adolescent sexual activity, and a commitment to keeping the child as safe as possible via preventative measures, while also recognizing the increasing independence that comes with adolescence. Okay, so you should be able to see in that quote all the evidence of care ethics from our previous discussion on care ethics. So the idea is centering not the individual physician or the individual patient, but actually centering the relationship, and not just the relationship between physician and patient, but also in this case between the physician, the patient, who's the adolescent, and the parent, because again, working with youth requires treating the family as a unit and thinking about all the contextual features that come with that child into care from a healthcare provider. So this quote, I think, really captures that kind of approach, and centering that triangular relationship, and valuing communication and conversations, open and honest conversations where young people can be informed about the risks of not getting vaccinated and the risks of HPV, acquiring HPV, and can talk openly about sexual activity and the acknowledgement that many young people are going to engage in sexual activity, even as adolescents and teenagers, while they're still minors legally under the care of their parents. So this approach sort of values and recognizes all that complexity, and takes this sort of context to be center, to be the most important part of the relationship between the physician and the adolescent, and how to make this decision. Okay, and it values the young person's safety, and it recognizes the complexity of the changing adolescent, because adolescents are increasing independence. They're getting more agency as they grow up. And these are all themes that came up also in the last reading on children and health, and the one that I made that video about with the Wilco song. Okay, so that's one important part of this discussion related to the Garden of Immunity in the last few pages of the article. The real key message here is that immunity is a public space. We're a garden within a garden, bearing both fruit and thorns. Okay, so what does that mean, we are a garden within a garden? Well, how are we a garden? Well, inside us, there are multiple living organisms. Some are good and some are bad, and they're all there all the time. So that's one thing to recognize, that, you know, as you eat different things and come in contact with different things in your surroundings, you're always exchanging content with your environment. It's not as if there's a strict barrier that is your skin. Your skin is not a strict, impermeable barrier. It is a permeable barrier with things living within it, and on the surface of your skin even there are different organisms surrounding you, and within and without you, and so within and outside of you. So that's the sense in which we are a garden. We're not just one individual organism. We are composed of multiple organisms that serve different roles and that have different propensities to harm or help us. And then likewise, you can see how this picture is just it's sort of shifting the spotlight to different levels of our existence. So inside of us there are multiple good and bad organisms, and outside of us there are multiple good and bad organisms and other people who will either contribute to our health as a collective or threaten our public health. So that's this idea of a garden within a garden. And whether we're immune to something like HPV depends largely on how others in the garden are acting to increase their immunity. Okay, one way this plays out is that many people, especially people in developed countries, well-off people, higher income people in countries like ours, make classist and racist assumptions about whether they need to get vaccinated. And this is part of why vaccines are more prevalent in developing countries, and Cambray shares a whole lot of statistics about that. And the sun is coming into my eyes. I'm going to just change the lighting here. She shares a whole bunch of information about the different rates of vaccines in developing countries, and part of the reason is that in more developed countries, people think a disease can't affect them because it's something that's over there and not something that I am actually susceptible to. And this idea of vaccination othering, which is closely related, that since this disease is not something I have to worry about because people like me are immune, I'm healthy, and I have all these resources that I need, and I wouldn't get sick like that. It's other people who need to get vaccinated. This is the classist and racist assumption about vaccination that affects who becomes vaccinated and who does not. And Cambray points out that when you have this attitude that vaccination is not something you need to worry about, it's something for the other people, the people who are under-resourced and unhealthy, and etc. When you have this classist, racist belief, then you sort of become a public health freeloader, in the sense that your health depends on other people being vaccinated. But the reason that you're able to stay safe, if you are able to stay safe, is partly because of people in your community getting vaccinated. So you benefit from their vaccinations without really acknowledging that. So that's the sense in which you become a public health freeloader. And we have this other quote, which is related, from page 132, that says, "Medicine can never be separated from the social environment in which it exists, and classist and racist beliefs about who may or may not be at risk expose deeper ethical questions about a society that divides its health resources among others, along historical lines. Okay, so take a look at that quote, go back and read it in context and make sure you understand it. It is about how the example of vaccination othering that I gave in the last slide is an example of how medicine cannot be separated from the social environment in which it exists. Moving on, she talks about going forward. I think that's the title of the last section here. Let's pull it up. We talked about those medical models and collective health and othering, vaccinations. Well, looking forward, she says, adolescents should be put front and center in this discussion. They're the ones most affected by this question of who should be vaccinated, so they should have a say in how we discuss vaccination. They have more agency than younger children, part of recognizing the complexity of age and, again, the context. So ethical questions do not exist independently of these kinds of contextual questions. So recognizing the context and the unique characteristics of teenagers involves recognizing that they have more agency than younger children, that they may engage in behaviors their parents don't condone, okay, that you can't always control a child's, an adolescent's sexual activity, and you certainly can't control the child's future sexual activity. And we have to acknowledge and respect young people by acknowledging that their bodies don't belong to their parents. Their bodies are not their parents' property. Their parents shouldn't be allowed to make decisions that have a negative impact upon their children's bodies. And just like their bodies don't belong to their parents, she goes on to say, sharing this quote from Biss, that your body doesn't belong to you. You don't own your body. That's not what we are. Our bodies are not independent. The health of our bodies always depends on choices other people are making. And this is back to that point about immunity being a shared space. And when other people are choosing to be vaccinated, you can be safe in that space, even if you choose not to be vaccinated. But that point urges us to think of immunity in this collective way. And we have to have that kind of perspective on immunity to understand our safety and how it depends upon other people's choices. And we have to take up a stance of supporting being vaccinated in order to achieve that kind of immunity, so that people who can't be vaccinated, like people with medical conditions that prevent them from being vaccinated, will also be safe in our communities. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this final quote, that immunity, this collective space that is impossible to maintain on one's own, is a gift that we are lucky to be able to bestow upon adolescents during a time of life that is otherwise uncertain. We should guide adolescents to become their own and each other's caretakers even before they are released into the deep wilderness of life outside of their parents' fences. So that's kind of sums up the her view that we need to vaccinate adolescents so that they understand the importance of taking care of each other, of viewing ourselves as a garden within a garden, and recognizing the shared space of immunity. So that's all I had to say about this article. I was hoping to make it in under 20 minutes. I'm 3 minutes over my time limit, but I hope that helps you in understanding the essay and thinking about it in case you're interested in writing about it for your papers, and also serves as a study guide for the final exam. See you later.